Well, Year 11, here we are, save the best till last. Finally made it to your last exam. It's been a long time coming. So let's get on with it. So, GCSE Food Preparation and Nutrition. Hopefully you are very familiar with the front cover of exams now. Fill in all your details, making sure you've signed it, include your candidate number, and note that this exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes long. For some of you, this is the longest exam you've done. If you've done technology, you've done a little bit longer, but it is 1 hour and 45 minutes because you need to be working for that length of time. Second half of the front cover details that you need a black pen and a pencil. You will mostly be working in pen though. I can't really think of any reason why you need a pencil in the exam, but take it there as a backup in case your pen runs out. But everything else should be in black pen. It's marked out of 100, so it's roughly 1 mark per minute. You're not marked on the quality of your written communication and your spellings, but you should try and make your writing and your explanations as clear as possible. The front page is likely to show the breakdown of the marks, but that doesn't help you with planning your timing. What will help you plan your timing is remembering that section A is the multiple choice and is 20 marks, so should take you 20 minutes. And the rest of the paper you need to be allocating a mark per minute. Section A is the multiple choice, as I've just said, and you all are very well practiced at making sure that you colour in the blob with a black pen to get the right answer. If you do it in pencil, it might not show up when they scan the papers in, so please do use your pen. Please be tidy with the blobs as well, so that there's no confusion about the answer that you are trying to give. If you happen to make a mistake, or when you go back and check you realise you need to correct something, then you put a neat cross through the initial blob and then colour in what you think is the correct example. Just in case you're not sure, on the food papers in the past they have given you an example of the question or how to answer a question, just in case you're not sure how to colour in a lozenge. Be warned, in the last couple of papers they have started the first question right underneath that example, and I've noticed in some of the PPE and mock papers that a few of you have missed question 1 just because you think it's part of the explanation on that first page. So make sure you check that you are starting at question 1 and not question 1.2. The multiple choice section could be knowledge from any part of the course and will test any part of the course. So it will test your knowledge of cooking and cooking methods, heat transfer methods. It will test your knowledge of nutrition, where foods come from, how people make decisions about what they're going to eat, and also health related issues and anything referring to health and safety with food and food safety. A good place, if you're worried about what knowledge you're supposed to know, a good place to go at this stage is Seneca, but also BBC Bitesize. There isn't AQA food on there, but there is of course something CCAC in food and nutrition. If you worked your way through that, that would give you the basic information that you need for the first section. But you should all be confident that you've done lots of learning. Lots of the questions we do, or well, all of the questions we do as Do Nows are these style of questions, and we've gathered so much knowledge over the last couple of years. This is a nice way to ease you into the exam. Section B is where you need to start giving longer answers, and the format of section B follows a fairly typical process over the last few years. It may well vary. We can't predict exactly what topics are going to be in this section, but they generally follow the pattern that they start off with food safety questions, move on to nutrition, particular health needs, and then looking at food provenance, food choice, food processing, and sustainability. So that's a rough order, but like I say, there's no guarantee. Some of the questions will be 12 marks long in this section, some of them will be 2 marks long, so you get a sort of undulating pace, so you get a little bit of a break every now and again from having to write a lot, but you must use the mark scheme to guide you. If it's a 12-mark answer, you need to be spending 12 minutes writing. There are extra pages at the back of the exam paper, so you make sure you are writing for those 12 minutes. It is not about just filling up the question space. You use the timing, please, to make sure you are getting as much information down as possible. So we normally kick off section C with food safety questions. So that's questions about where to store food, how to store food, at what temperature, so being really clear on what happens to microorganisms at the different stages of the thermometer is imperative for this section. Last couple of years the questions have been about chicken, so I think I would predict that they won't be about chicken this year. So they could be about fish, or they could be about beef. All of which are high protein foods, and therefore they are high risk foods. Could also be about dairy products, but any food that is moist and made of protein is of particular risk of microorganisms developing that could cause harm. Remember your definition of cross-contamination. That is a question that comes up nearly every year. So what is cross-contamination? Remember to use the word pathogens instead of bacteria. It makes you sound more knowledgeable. This is generally a nice safety zone because we know how to cook safely. The basic food hygiene is the same for every recipe. So they might give you a recipe and explain what you would do to cook it hygienically. Well, first stage is always washing your hands, don't cough and sneeze, put your hair up, things like that. But knowing your clear temperatures is really, really important. So this knowledge organiser summarises everything about the terminology to do with food safety. Remember, the phrase for ambient storage means that it is stored in a cupboard. There is a difference between use by and best before. And the temperature zones, you need to know the danger zone, and you must know that food has to be heated or reheated to 75 degrees for a period of 2 minutes to make sure that it is cooked safely. Food safety is something you should be really, really confident with, but here's a second slide that will help you. So make sure you know what the different coloured chopping boards are used for, certainly red, green and blue. And personal hygiene is obviously very important. There has been a question in the past about how to use a food probe to test the thermometer of meat product, test the temperature, sorry, of meat products. So in this knowledge organiser, there's a procedure you would follow when using the food probe, and it's about making sure that you're not cross-contaminating the meat by using a dirty food probe and then not remembering to clean it afterwards. So it may crop up this year, I don't know. Like I say, we haven't seen it for a couple of years, so it's worthwhile you preparing that. After food safety, they often move on to the nutrition questions, and there could be 2, 3 or 4 nutritional based questions. It's also where the life stage questions come in. So last year's paper was very much about university students and how what they were eating could be setting in good or bad habits for their future. So they could go younger than that, and you might need to talk about growing children. They could go older than that and look at elderly people. There was also questions in last year's paper about a range of different people. They haven't traditionally asked about pregnancy and babies, which might mean that's a gap they're going to fill this year, but I would just say probably they won't be asking about adolescents and young adults because that was in last year's paper. There's often a question where they give a diet for what, or a meal that a particular age range eats. So you need to be analysing and evaluating the quality of that meal. When you analyse, you're just making a point. When you're evaluating, you're saying whether that point is a good or a bad thing for that particular person. So in this example, which we've looked at before, Amy, who's a 10-year-old girl, has a cheese sandwich made with white bread and butter for lunch. So that's a fact. She has a cheese sandwich made with white bread and butter. The evaluation is deciding what is good and bad about that. So the good points about that is she's getting lots of energy. She's a 10-year-old. She needs to have enough energy to be able to go through her school day and also to exercise enough. She's getting a little bit of protein from the cheese, but maybe not enough. What she is getting is quite a lot of saturated fat, so you'd identify why that might not be so good for Amy, particularly setting the scene for future life. And you'd also explain why white bread could be improved by making it wholemeal bread to improve her dietary fibre intake. So to analyse, you're looking at what is the fact and then saying whether it's good or bad, and trying to then suggest what this person could do differently. When we've looked at this before, it's glaringly obvious there's no fruit or vegetables and there's an awful lot of sugar. So if we're looking at children, their dietary health includes their teeth as well as their actual body. It's massively important that you know the 8 tips for health eating well, because they apply to every single person in whatever age range. It's also massively important that you talk about the Eat Well guide in those questions. Everybody, unless you're under the age of 2, should be following the guidelines of the Eat Well guide to plan and organise the proportion of your meals. So always talk about the Eat Well guide in those nutritional questions. There's a very quick recap of what happens to people's bodies at different ages on the side of this knowledge organizer as well, that will help you. Don't forget that eating healthily has to include hydration and having 8 glasses of water rather than sugary sweet drinks. So there will be, I would say, 2 or 3, maybe even 4 questions about nutrition. The nutrition questions start off about life stage, but then they move on to looking at what can happen to your body if you don't eat healthily. Last year, the big focus of that question was osteoporosis, so we can breathe a sigh of relief because we can think it's probably not going to be osteoporosis again, because that wasn't a particularly easy one. My guessing would be that it might be about cardiovascular disease, which is about blood flow around the whole body. Remember, that's why you've got a picture of a human being on there. Or coronary artery disease, which is specifically about heart disease. But make sure you're prepared for talking about body mass as well, kindly, politely, not offensively. We try not to talk in terms of being fat. We use things about being overweight and underweight. Anemia often crops up as a problem, particularly for females. So gen up that you know what anemia is and how you can solve anemia, and also make sure that you understand diabetes. But be aware that osteoporosis happens and bone disease happen if you don't eat enough calcium and vitamin D, but it's unlikely that's going to crop up particularly much. This question hasn't popped up for a couple of years, so it's sensible to consider that iron deficiency might crop up. So iron deficiency and anemia makes you feel very, very tired, very cold, and you need to try and increase your intake of iron. If you need to increase your intake of iron, you should also have lots of vitamin C to help your body absorb that iron. Particularly easy to get iron from meat products and eggs, but if you are a vegan, you can also get iron from green leafy vegetables and jacket potato skins and things. So my hunch is this might well crop up this year. This particular question is one that I might advise you prepare for as well. Obviously, it's significantly important to keep hearts healthy, and there wasn't a question about it last year. This is a question from 2 years ago, so I think preparing for this would be wise. Linked to the nutrition questions, they are likely to ask some very direct questions about the nutritional benefits of each of the macronutrients. So you are very confident on why we have macronutrients in our body. All of them, of course, give us energy, but we should use carbohydrates for most of our energy. If we want to gain or lose weight, we would control the amount of fat we use for energy, and we need to make sure we're eating enough carbohydrates so that we don't use protein for energy, because we need protein for lots of other things. Try to understand the nutritional value of each of the macronutrients, and also how we can make sure we can get those macronutrients into our diet. So things like understanding LBV and HBV proteins and protein complementation are really important. Don't forget, when we talk about carbohydrates, we also need to consider dietary fibre, so that we don't become constipated and that we get enough energy from B vitamins. Food choice is a really significant area of the curriculum, and we choose foods for all sorts of reasons. We choose them because of our nutritional needs in the life stages. We choose them because of our lifestyle, because of what we like. Food preference is really important. We're influenced to eat different foods by trends and by marketing techniques, but also what we believe and how, you know, our religious beliefs can come into it, and the effect what we eat can be affected by our religion. So hopefully, if you've gone through the knowledge on Seneca, you'll have some examples in your head if you come across a question like this, where you would be expected to give examples of how moral and ethical beliefs can affect what we eat. A moral choice is something like vegetarianism, veganism, using organic food, eating only free-range food, because that's the right thing to do to stop it causing harm to other people. Buying fair trade is a moral choice, because you're making sure people are being paid the right amount of money, and ethical comes underneath that as well. Anything that's religious is linked to the beliefs of different faiths. So moral and ethical beliefs are about doing the right thing by the food. Sustainability links to that, and that's another big area of questioning usually. And sustainability in food is about food production, and how long can we keep doing what we're doing in terms of food production. So current understanding is that we cannot sustain the amount of meat that we currently eat as a world. We can't farm enough meat. It's going to mean that we don't have enough fields to grow crops, so therefore we should be reducing the amount of meat and following a plant-based diet sometimes. And that's all about sustainability. If you can keep it going, then it's sustainable, and if it can't carry on for a long time, that's not sustainable. Sustainable fishing is often questioned. So it's not sustainable to fish all of the cod out of the ocean in one go, because then there's no more cod left in the ocean to breed more cod. So you have to control how many cod are fished in a given year or breeding season to make sure that there's enough mating pairs left to create more fish. It's just common sense, really. So there are problems with intensive farming around sustainability. It can damage the environment, and it can mean that things can't happen for a long time, keep going for a long time. Intensive farming is when we have a lot of yield, and there are good things about that. It means that we can all get the foods that we want in plenty of numbers, and we're not affected by seasonality. But the disadvantage is that there's lots of pollution from transportation and fertilizing and all sorts of things. So there will definitely be environmental questions. Packaging of food comes into that section. So explaining how consumers can reduce the amount of single-use plastic packaging when buying food. You could answer that without having studied food prep for the last 2 years. It's common sense. We know how to reduce packaging. We know about using bags for life and paper, or just not using packaging at all. Buying things loose rather than buying them in a ready packed plastic packet, things like that. So there definitely will be sustainability questions. Now we know food processing is likely to come up, or always does come up. Last year it was jam making. The year before that it was the cheese question that you've both all had a go at in the last couple of exam papers, which leaves us with the idea that it might be about processing wheat, flour, and then maybe bread or pasta, or looking at yogurt production. Looking back at past papers, sometimes they include looking at how flour is produced as well as the actual bread. You should be confident with the bread making process. Just think back to what you've done in lessons. But you can also do lots of research about how bread is made in factories. We have revised that recently in lessons. So as long as you've taken those resources home, that will be helpful. In terms of the milling the flour, we don't really do an awful lot of that sort of thing and talk about how it's processed, but this is quite a nice question to revise it. So it gives you a diagram of what a grain of wheat looks like. It's worth you remembering that. It's a diagram you've got in your books and I've drawn on the board before for you. It's the different parts of a grain of flour. The endosperm is the soft floury stuff inside. The bran is the husk on the outside. They start off, to mill it is to break up. They need to clean it first to remove the dirt and soften the grain. They then mill it, so they squash it to release the white endosperm inside. They might then sieve the flour to take away the bran. Either all of the bran if they're making white flour, or some of the bran if they're making brown flour. So whether you're preparing for the bread or a pasta question, it's worth understanding where the flour comes from in the first place. My hunch is that the process question will be about bread. So this is an example that they've done in the past. And when they did the cheese making question, they gave parts of the process for. So it's about thinking about the functional ingredients. So why are those ingredients there and what do they do? And hopefully the amount of times we've gone through this, you will be really, really confident here. You also need to know about micronutrients, of course. Make sure you understand or know which ones are fat soluble, so vitamin A, D, E and K, and also the ones that are water soluble. And if you use the link on this slide, it will help you find out about which ones, what you need to eat in terms of minerals. Different methods of cooking affect how well those vitamins and minerals are retained in food. Essentially, if you cook the food in a liquid, so by boiling or simmering or poaching, you will degrade those minerals and vitamins, and they will leach into the water and be lost when you throw it away, when you throw the water away. If you cook it without using water, so steaming, stir frying, something very quick, then you lose less vitamins, so therefore the food is more healthy for you. If you cook it in a liquid where you eat the liquid, something like simmering in a bolognese or stewing in the oven, then the vitamins will leach into the cooking liquor and you'll be able to still eat some of those minerals and vitamins. There will certainly be information about food science or questions about food science. You should hopefully be really confident with that by now. Food science is either going to happen with fats, carbohydrates or proteins. so it's macronutrient based. Anything involving carbohydrates, you're either going to be caramelizing or dextrinizing, which causes toast. So think about what's happening to the carbohydrate molecules. Try to describe what happens to those carbohydrate molecules. You should be confident in what is a sweet and savoury carbohydrate now in terms of mono, di and polysaccharides. So try to use those technical terms. If we're looking at proteins, we're looking at denaturation and coagulation. If you're asked to give an example, then an egg is always a really good example, but we can also denature protein by marinating meat with acids so that it becomes softer, so something like a lemon juice, and then coagulating when we cook it. If they ask you about denaturation and coagulation, they sometimes tell you what they want to talk about, so really read the question carefully. Emulsification is about binding oil and water together with an emulsifier, and mayonnaise is a good example of that. And if we're talking about fats, then the food science involving fats is shortening and rubbing fat around flour molecules so that it can't absorb the water. The one question that regularly crops up is gelatinization, which we have rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. You must learn the temperature differences and what happens to the starch molecules at each of the temperatures. It may well not crop up at all because it's cropped up so regularly, but it does almost seem to be a yearly thing now. So make sure you can describe in words and or diagrams how gelatinization happens. When they start the science questions, or they ask you a question, for instance, explain how gelatinization happens, make sure you define what gelatinization is. If they ask you how coagulation happens, define what it is first. Show the examiner in your first sentence that you know that gelatinization is the thickening of a sauce, that coagulation is the setting of a protein, dextrinization is the browning of a starch with dry heat. Tell them what you know and then explain how that process happens. We've talked about food choice a little bit. Food choice can really be influenced by marketing. So there's some information here for you to work through at your own pace about how food might be marketed to you. We need to do a little bit, or you might need to do a little bit of revision on heat transfer and the difference between conduction, convection and radiation. These diagrams should help you. Conduction happens through materials that conduct heat. So think about what you know from science as well. Wood, plastic do not conduct heat. Metal does. So conduction will happen when a metal is heated, and that heat is directly to food, maybe from a baking tray or from the metal to water. Convection is when the heat travels through liquid or air, and radiation is something like grilling or toasting, where the heat moves directly sideways or vertically from the heat source to the food. Infrared radiation happens inside a microwave. Sometimes there's questions where they ask you to explain how heat is transferred to the food. There was a question not long ago about how rice was heated up, and what they wanted the students to do was explain that the saucepan is heated up through radiation from the gas flame, and then the hot saucepan conducts heat to the water. The water then heats the rice through convection. So it's about thinking about the process of what happens when we're heating food. Sustainability I've already mentioned, but make sure you understand why we need to buy sustainably, and how we can buy sustainably by buying local produce. Think about foods that are seasonal, think about availability, and think about the local economy. When I talked to some of you about this week, you were really confident on this area, so that's good. Other ethical things we need to think about are fair trade. So here are some advantages and disadvantages of fair trade food to think about. Okay, so that was a very whistle-stop tour through the exam paper. We know what to expect from the paper. You've had lots of practices. It's just really important that those longer answers, you don't avoid them, and that you do use this time properly. As I said earlier, it's not about filling up the space with really big writing really quickly. This is about using a minute per mark to answer in as much depth with as many examples as you can. You've got lots of experience of cooking behind you. Think about what other people have cooked as well. Think about when we've cooked bread, when we've cooked pasta, when we've cooked meringue, when we've done some real technical things, and that will help you explain processes in with a lot more ease. So good luck in your final evening's preparation. I will look forward to seeing you Tuesday morning. Breakfast will be available in 124 with Mr. McGethy and I. Hopefully I have already seen lots of you today in our warm-up sessions period 3 and 4, but we'll have breakfast Tuesday morning with a little bit of revision involved in that, and then after 10:45 you will be free. See you Tuesday.